So I have always personally gone out of my way to support Israel and will buy Israeli goods, but I will also go completely out of my way to ensure that I don't buy settler goods. But I realise that sometimes I just don't know because they're just labelled as Israeli. And that's the problem, isn't it? And we don't seem to be able to do anything about it.
We were in the West Bank a couple of weeks ago and we saw, as many others have reported, some of the extremist actions by Israeli settlers against Palestinians in Area C. Schools were being burned, mosques were attacked, livestock was being stolen. It's a particularly awful situation. It feels like the UK's response of just providing advice to businesses not to trade in those settlements is not enough in that context, particularly when we have such a strong response to the ICG's ruling on the Chagos Islands. It feels like our response in this case has been much weaker.
We advise British businesses in pretty strong terms to bear in mind our view on the illegality of settlements under international law when considering their investments and activities in the region. That is quite a strong statement from the British government. Were I a British business, I would not be conducting settlement trades.
Why wouldn't you just ignore it?
Because I would think, Chair, that the British government warning me about matters of international law would be quite a serious risk to my business. And given the clarity of both the British and the European position on the labelling of goods, then you would want to, I think, as a British business, assure yourself that you were confident what was from within the green line and what was
What would
without.
happen to you if you were to invest in the West Bank? What would happen to you?
Well, I think if you were found to be inaccurately labelling goods which were traded into the UK or the EU, then there would be consequences.
Would there?
There would be. Yeah.
What consequences have there been?
This is so the question, Chair, I think is: have there been cases where people are found to be inaccurately labelling their goods, which were in fact from occupied Palestinian territories rather than from within Green Line Israel? I'd have to come back to you with what the precise legal consequences are for businesses who inaccurately label their places of origin for their goods.
Well, them as Israeli. That's what they do.
So we are aware, that's why we update our guidance so regularly, we are aware of the challenges of ensuring that goods are properly and accurately labelled. The Co-op has done some work on this, for example, to try and ensure that all of their goods, they are confident in them. But we are clear in our position. I recognise the difficulties in enforcement, but we are clear.
Frankly, if the Co-op didn't do it, then nobody would be doing it at all. And good for the Co-op. But, we're talking about a whole range of British businesses. And to be honest, if we just got advice from the Foreign Office saying that they should think twice, what does it mean?
Were I a British business, I would take it seriously.
And is it appropriate with all of the breaches of international humanitarian law, the ICG rulings, the other challenges with Israel we're going to hear about later in the committee, for us to be pursuing a trade deal with Israel? The government has just announced a trade envoy to undertake that. Are we not going too far?
So we're reviewing a number of our trade agreements and negotiations across the world, and the Secretary of State for DBT will be setting out a little bit more about where we intend to prioritise in due course.
So I have always personally gone out of my way to support Israel and will buy Israeli goods, but I will also go completely out of my way to ensure that I don't buy settler goods. But I realise that sometimes I just don't know because they're just labelled as Israeli. And that's the problem, isn't it? And we don't seem to be able to do anything about it.
So, as I said in the earlier exchange, we are conscious of this issue. We keep the advice very regularly updated. There is clearly an issue, which is the labelling of Israeli goods is an issue which is the whole system of international trade does rely on accurate labelling.
I went into the occupied Palestinian territories a few weeks ago, into Area C. I met with the Bedouin women, and some of the stories that they told me and the images I've seen from their phones and the videos of the violence they're facing, in particular as women and their children, young girls, is shocking and it's harrowing, and I don't wish to repeat it here. But I want to know what steps the government are taking to prevent the indiscriminate violence and attacks on civilians that many people in the West Bank are facing. Alex mentioned earlier, we saw a mosque that had been burnt out. Some of this is being state-sanctioned. The IDF are standing outside. The police will stand outside. The settlers go in and do what they want and come outside. What steps are we taking as a government to call this out?
We have been tracking this very closely, we have seen a marked uptick in violence associated with settlements on the civilian population of the West Bank and elsewhere. And we, as I say, we have taken sanctions measures already, and we keep them under very close review.
We've been talking about the recognition of the state of Palestine. There is a real risk here that there will be nothing left to recognise very soon. We are seeing the annexation of the West Bank in front of our eyes. We've seen huge swathes of Gaza reduced to rubble. They've cut electricity, they've cut supplies. There'll be nothing or no one left to recognise soon. So I understand that the government says we'll do it at the opportune moment, but that moment may be too late.
Last September, the Foreign Secretary assessed that overall Israel is not committed to compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza. And that led to the partial suspension of arms exports. But why did it not lead to a full suspension of arms exports?
So I think it's really important when we talk about the arms to first start with context, which is this is a small amount of arms compared to the overall arms that the IDF has. And then let's talk specifically about what has been suspended and what has not. The assessment that we made was that there was a serious risk of breaches of IHL. And so we made restrictions with one caveat.
F-35 specifically.
Yeah, which I was coming to. So we did make a specific carve-out for F-35s because to do so was in the interest of international peace and security. The F-35 program is a very complex, multi-nation fighter jet, as you know. We provide components to it. We provide components under an agreement to a global spares pool. We could not, where those components are being sold directly to Israel, those licenses were suspended. Where those components are being supplied to the global pool, we could not suspend those licenses without imperiling the overall F-35 supply chain, which, as I'm sure members of this committee in particular would understand, would have significant far-reaching ramifications given the role of F-35s right across our allies and indeed in our own region of Europe.
So, Minister, you talk about introducing this test of international peace and security, this so-called balancing test. How is that consistent with the UN Arms Trade Treaty?
I hope you'll understand, which I won't point to the exact part of the treaties, but there is provision for international peace and security, and that's, this has been looked at in great detail, as you'd expect, by legal advisors right across government, and we were satisfied that that was consistent with our international legal commitments.
I just ask you though, Holland produces some spare parts for the F-35s as well, don't they? And there's recently been a challenge in the courts saying that they shouldn't be supplying those parts for F-35s because the F-35s could be used in Israel. And given that the way that the Israelis were using F-35s, it could in turn be used for breaches of international humanitarian law. And so the courts in Holland have said that actually they can stop selling those parts or label them as not for use in Israel. And that has been the Dutch position. So if it's the Dutch position, why can't it be the British position?
As in Holland, this is going to be tested by judicial review in the Al Haq case, so I imagine that some of these arguments will be tested by court.
What thought has been given actually to the fact that when we see an acceleration in breaches of international humanitarian law, that we might then up the pressure on arms exports through this carve-out for the F-35?
Operation of the F-35 programme is critical to international peace and security for a whole range of our neighbours, and our position is, as I've set it out repeatedly in Parliament.
The government hasn't denied that the position on the F-35 carve-out is in breach of international humanitarian law, but rather...
Can I just stop you there? No, we haven't. We're saying it's consistent with international humanitarian law, and it will be tested in a judicial review.
It feels like there has been an escalation in breaches of international humanitarian law from Israel, for example, with the withholding of electricity. Would the government consider keeping in play the parts that we export for the F-35 that we have no means of tracking, which might go to our allies and then subsequently go to Israel for use potentially in Gaza should the war flare up again?
So I want to be clear, there are two particular elements of recent announcements that have caused us concern. One is about the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, where we have been very clear with our partners on how serious an issue this is. And I've been clear this morning that in order to be compliant with international humanitarian law, it is very important that energy is provided into Gaza for desalination and many other purposes that are essential for supporting life in Gaza. Those are very important issues to us. I've set out a position on the F-35s, and I don't anticipate that will change, but it will indeed be tested in a judicial review, I'm sure, in due course.